I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who kept secrets. I always prided myself on honesty, on loyalty, on being the good wife. But the truth is, I've been lying to myself for years. It started long before I ever stepped outside my marriage, before I ever whispered words I shouldn't have to someone who wasn't my husband. It started the day I chose love over my father's approval. My father, Robert Ellison, was a powerful man. A lawyer with a reputation that sent men trembling in the courtroom. He built his empire on fear, respect, and an unshakable belief that he knew what was best. And he made it clear from the beginning that Daniel, my husband, wasn't good enough for me. I still remember the look on his face when I told him I was engaged. Disgust, disappointment, anger. He barely let me finish before he scoffed. "You're really going to marry that low-educated idiot?" Daniel was nothing like the men my father had wanted for me. He wasn't a lawyer or a doctor or an executive from a family with old money. He was a construction worker, a man who built homes with his own two hands. He worked long hours, came home covered in sweat and sawdust, and never cared for the expensive suits and social circles my family moved in. He was real solid, the kind of man who would never let me down. At least that's what I believed back then. My father tried everything to stop me. He threatened to cut me off, to disown me, to make sure Daniel never had a job in this city again. But I stood my ground. I told myself that love was more important than comfort, than security, than the life I had grown up with. I married Daniel in a small ceremony, my mother crying in the front row, my father refusing to even show up. That day I thought I had won. But love changes over time. What starts as passion, as rebellion, as the burning need to prove everyone wrong, cools into something else. Something quieter, something routine. The late nights waiting for him to come home. The exhaustion in his eyes. The way his hands, once so eager to touch me, grew callous from years of labor. The romance faded, and I found myself missing things I never thought I would. The finer things. The admiration. The excitement. I still loved Daniel, I think. I wanted to believe that. But as the years went by, the whispers of doubt grew louder. And then I met Adam. Adam wasn't like Daniel. He was sharp, polished, successful. He reminded me of the men my father had once wanted me to marry. He was a client at the firm where I worked, charming and confident, the kind of man who knew his worth and didn't apologize for it. He noticed things about me that Daniel never did anymore. The way I styled my hair, the perfume I wore, the colors I chose for my nails. He made me feel like I was someone desirable again, not just a wife, not just a partner in a life that had grown predictable. I told myself it was harmless. Flirting. Smiling at his jokes. Meeting for coffee under the excuse of work. I swore I would never cross that line. But the problem with lines is that once you let yourself get close enough, they blur. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. That I was weak. That I wouldn't let it happen again. But then there was a second time. A third. Soon it wasn't just about Adam, it was about me. About how I felt. About the way he made my heart race when he touched me. About the thrill of sneaking around, of knowing something that Daniel didn't. I thought I had everything under control. That I could have both. That I could keep my marriage and my secret world with Adam separate. But secrets have a way of unraveling. And I never expected that the man who once called Daniel a low-educated idiot would be the one to bring my entire life crashing down. I told myself I was careful, I convinced myself that I knew what I was doing, that I could keep everything balanced, keep my marriage intact while indulging in something that was mine alone. But the problem with deception is that it never stays hidden forever. And I was about to learn that the hard way. It started with small things. Daniel wasn't a suspicious man. He never asked too many questions, never pressed when I said I had to stay late at work or meet a friend for dinner, but I started noticing the way his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, the way he hesitated before answering when I told him my plans. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I knew something was different deep down. I felt it. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at me, maybe it was paranoia, but I started to wonder if he was beginning to see the cracks in the life we had built together. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining things. After all, I had been careful. I deleted messages. I was discreet when I slipped away to be with Adam. I planned everything down to the last detail, making sure there were no loose ends, no way for Daniel to connect the dots. But then something happened that I hadn't planned for. My father returned to my life after years of silence, after years of pretending I didn't exist. He was suddenly there, a storm rolling back into my world, as if he had never left. I hadn't spoken to him since my wedding. He had made it clear that I was dead to him, that I had made my choice and there would be no second. Chances and I had been fine with that. I told myself I didn't need his approval, didn't need his wealth, his influence, his arrogance, but then one evening I walked into work and there he was sitting in the firm's conference room like he owned the place, and in a way he did. Robert Ellison wasn't just any lawyer. He was a force of nature, a man whose name carried weight in every courtroom in the state. He had been hired by one of our biggest clients, and now he was here making himself comfortable in a space that I had thought was mine. I froze for just a second, but that was all it took for his sharp gaze to lock onto me, his expression unreadable, his eyes sweeping over me as if he was evaluating my very existence. Still the same disappointment, still the same disapproval. I swallowed hard, forced myself to keep walking as if he was just another client, but I knew better. I felt his presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. When I finally sat at my desk, my hands were shaking. I hated that he could still do that to me, hated that after all these years, after everything I had fought for, he could still make me feel like a foolish little girl, but I refused to let him see it. I buried myself in work, forced myself to focus until I could push him out of my mind. Later that evening, as I was gathering my things to leave, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and my breath caught a message from Adam. Dinner tonight, miss you. I hesitated, my mind still clouded from the encounter with my father. I knew that I should just go home to Daniel, pretend everything was normal, pretend that I wasn't walking a tightrope stretched dangerously thin, but instead I found myself typing back okay where the restaurant was dimly lit, secluded, just how I liked it. Adam was already waiting, a glass of wine in front of him, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. God, you're beautiful, he murmured as I slid into the booth across from him, his fingers brushing against mine. For a moment I let myself get lost in it, the warmth of his touch, the way his voice sent shivers down my spine. But just as I was about to lean into the illusion, just as I was about to surrender to the escape, I felt it, a presence watching me. I turned my head and my stomach dropped. Across the restaurant, sitting at a table near the back, was my father, his eyes locked onto mine, cold, calculating. And for the first time in my life I saw something in them that I had never seen before. Amusement. He knew he had caught me, and the worst part was, I had no idea what he was going to do with it. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My father just sat there, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass, watching me like a predator who had already decided how the hunt would end. Adam noticed my sudden stillness. He followed my gaze, then turned back to me, brows furrowed. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a smile, but my hands trembled under the table. Fine, I need a minute. I stood too fast, nearly knocking over my glass. I couldn't sit there, I couldn't pretend like everything was normal when I knew that my father had seen me, had caught me, had probably already calculated exactly how he was going to use this against me. Excuse me, I muttered before rushing toward the restroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor inside. I gripped the edge of the sink, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't happening, this couldn't be happening. I had been so careful, I had built my life with Daniel so meticulously, balancing my my affair, my career, and now in one careless moment I had lost control. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My father wasn't just any man, he was a man who could ruin people effortlessly, a man who had spent his life dismantling the weak with nothing more than words and influence. If he wanted to destroy me, he would, and I had given him the perfect weapon against me. I didn't know how long I stood there, but eventually I had to leave. I couldn't hide in the bathroom forever. When I returned to the table, Adam was waiting, a concerned look on his face, but I barely noticed him. My father was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He hadn't approached me, hadn't made a scene, hadn't spoken a word to me, but somehow that was worse. I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls, nothing but silence, and that silence terrified me. Adam reached for my hand, squeezing it softly. Do you want to talk about it? I hesitated for a split second, then shook my head. No, just a rough day at work. He didn't press, he never did. That was one of the reasons I had fallen into this affair so easily with Adam. There were no expectations, no hard conversations, just stolen moments of pleasure and distraction. But now those moments were tainted by the reality of what I had done. I barely ate, I barely spoke. The entire dinner was a blur. When I finally left, Adam walked me to my car, lingering in the dim glow of the parking lot. Are you sure you're okay? I nodded, lying through my teeth. I just need some sleep. He kissed me, a soft lingering kiss that once would have left me breathless but now felt like a mistake. When I got home, Daniel was already asleep, his arm draped over my side of the bed like he had reached for me in his sleep. Guilt crashed over me like a tidal wave. I crawled into bed beside him, carefully not to wake him, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I didn't belong there. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my father's expression, that cold, knowing amusement. The next morning I went to work like nothing had happened, but the tension sat heavy in my chest, waiting for the inevitable. And then just before lunch my phone buzzed, a single message from an unknown number. But I knew exactly who it was. We need to talk. The courthouse, 3 o'clock sharp. Do not make me wait. My hands went numb. I had no choice. I knew that ignoring him would only make things worse. So when 3 o'clock arrived I found myself Stepping into that courthouse, my stomach twisted into knots. My father stood in the corridor waiting, as if he had never doubted for a second that I would come when he saw me. He smirked, not a smile, not a look of warmth, just pure calculation, his eyes sweeping over me as if I was nothing more than another case file to dismantle. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, voice smooth as ever. "Let's discuss how you're going to fix this before I decide to do it for you." My father's voice was calm, measured, but I knew better. His words were never just words, they were loaded weapons waiting to be fired. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze despite the way my stomach churned. "I don't know what you think you saw," but he cut me off before I could even attempt to lie. "Don't insult me, Olivia." His voice sharpened like the edge of a blade. I saw exactly what I needed to see, and so would Daniel if I were to tell him. My mouth went dry, my body stiffened. He leaned in slightly, his presence suffocating. "This is what happens when you make foolish choices, Olivia. You thought you were smart, thought you could play in both worlds, but you forget I built those worlds." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breath. I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. I had built a life away from him. I had fought for my independence, for my marriage, for everything I had. I wasn't going to let him rip it away from me. "What do you want?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. He studied me for a moment, then smirked. "Now we're speaking the same language. I'm giving you an opportunity, Olivia," he said smoothly, "to correct your mistake before it ruins you." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Correct my mistake? And what exactly does that mean?" His eyes darkened. "It means you end whatever it is you think you have with that man, and you do it immediately. If I ever see you with him again, if I so much as hear a whisper of his name tied to yours, I will personally make sure that Daniel knows every detail, that your life crumbles before your eyes." He let the words settle between us, let them dig in deep before continuing. "And I don't just mean your marriage, Olivia. I mean your job, your reputation, your entire existence. You forget that I still have connections. I could end you with a phone call." I felt a lump rise in my throat, bile creeping up my chest. My father never made empty threats. He didn't need to. When he promised destruction, it came swiftly and without mercy. He must have seen the panic in my face, because his smirk widened. "Relax, sweetheart. You'll thank me one day. Marriages go through rough patches, but you don't throw everything away over a little excitement. Now be a good wife and go home where you belong." I hated him. I hated him for being right, for having the power to control me even after all these years. But most of all, I hated myself, because deep down I knew I had no choice. If I defied him, he would follow through and my entire life would be reduced to rubble. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. His smile was victorious. "Good girl. Now run along and don't make me clean up your mess again." I turned on my heel and walked out of that courthouse, my legs unsteady, my mind spinning. But I already knew what I had to do that evening. As the sun set and my hands trembled around my phone, I typed the message, "Adam, we need to talk. It's over." I stared at the message on my screen for what felt like an eternity, my fingers hovering over the send button, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. Was it regret, fear, relief? I didn't know. All I knew was that my father had backed me into a corner, and no matter how much I wanted to fight back, I couldn't. Daniel didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to have his world ripped apart because of my selfishness. I pressed send. My hands felt numb the moment the message disappeared from my screen. It was done. There was no going back. Seconds later, my phone buzzed, Adam's name flashing across the screen. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to answer. "Liv." His voice was laced with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "This isn't working," I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. "We have to stop this. We can't do this anymore." Silence stretched between us before he finally spoke. "Olivia, what happened? Talk to me. I can fix this." His desperation made my throat tighten, but I couldn't let myself falter. I had to make this clean, cold, final. "I don't want this anymore, Adam," I lied, forcing steel into my words. "I was selfish. I got caught up in something stupid, but I love my husband, and this was a mistake. I shouldn't have let it go on as long as it did." Adam exhaled sharply, disbelief coloring his voice. "You're lying. Something happened. I can hear it in your voice. Is it Daniel? Does he know?" I clenched my jaw. "No. And he never will, because this is over. Please don't make this harder than it already is." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can just erase this like it never happened, like we never happened, Olivia? You told me you were miserable. You told me you felt trapped, and now you're just walking away." I closed my eyes against the sting of his words. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him that none of this was my choice, that I was being forced to abandon him. But I couldn't, because my father was right. If I tried to hold on to this, if I let Adam believe there was a chance, he would never let me go, and my father would make sure Daniel found out. And that was a risk I couldn't take. "Adam," I whispered, my voice shaking, "don't call me again. Don't text. Don't show up at the office. We're done." I hung up before he could say another word, before he could try to make me change my mind. The moment the call ended, my hands trembled so violently I had to set my phone down. I had done what my father wanted. I had walked away from Adam. I had done the right thing. So why did it feel like my chest was caving in? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, feeling nothing. When I finally moved, when I finally got up and forced myself to drive home, Daniel was waiting for me at the dining table, a warm smile on his face. "Dinner's almost ready," he said casually. "I figured you'd had a long day, so I made your favorite pasta." My stomach twisted at the sight of him, at the pure untainted love in his eyes. I had spent years telling myself I still loved him, but standing there in that moment I realized I had no idea what love was anymore. All I knew was that the guilt was suffocating and I didn't know if I could live with that. I sat across from Daniel at the dinner table, forcing myself to eat, forcing myself to smile, forcing myself to pretend that I wasn't dying inside. He talked about his day, about a new project he was working on, about the guys at work and the jokes they made. I nodded at the right moments, laughed when I was supposed to. But my mind was somewhere else. My father had won. Adam was gone. And I was sitting here, pretending like I hadn't just killed a part of myself to keep my life intact. Daniel reached for my hand across the table, his thumb brushing over my skin, warm and steady. "You've been quiet tonight," he said gently, searching my face. "Everything okay?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "Yeah, just tired. Work has been a lot lately." It wasn't a lie, at least not completely. Work had been stressful, but that wasn't why I felt like I was unraveling. That wasn't why my chest felt tight, why my stomach twisted with every affectionate glance Daniel gave me. If he knew, if he ever found out, this moment, this quiet, simple moment of domestic peace, would never exist again. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, and crawled into bed while Daniel cleaned up downstairs. When he finally came to bed, he wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close the way he always did. I lay stiff in his embrace, my back against his chest, my mind racing. How long would this feeling last? This suffocating weight, this guilt pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe? Would it ever go away? Or was this my punishment for what I had done? The next morning, I woke up to a text from Adam. "I don't believe you." A chill ran down my spine. My hands tightened around my phone as I stared at the message. He wasn't letting this go. My father had warned me that if I didn't end it completely, he would do it for me, and I had no doubt what that would look like. My heart pounded as I typed back. "Please, just move on." The dots appeared, showing he was typing. Then they disappeared. He didn't respond. I tried to go about my day as if everything was normal, but I was unraveling. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Every time Daniel looked at me for too long, I wondered if he could see the guilt written all over my face. I threw myself into work, desperate for a distraction, but even that couldn't save me. And then just when I thought I was getting a grip on myself, my world tilted again. Daniel called me in the afternoon, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach drop. "Hey babe. Just ran into someone interesting." I swallowed hard. "Oh? Who?" A pause. Then, "Your dad." The air left my lungs. "Oh," I forced out. "What did he want?" Daniel chuckled, but it was dry, humorless. "Funny thing. He said we should get dinner sometime. That he wants to get to know me better." My blood ran cold. My father. The man who had called Daniel a low-educated idiot? The man who had refused to even acknowledge our marriage? Now he suddenly wanted to have dinner? No, this wasn't about reconnecting. This was about control. About reminding me that he was still pulling the strings. Daniel kept talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. My father wasn't finished with me yet. And I had no idea what his next move would be. I could barely hear Daniel's voice over the pounding in my ears. My father wanted dinner? After all these years? After everything he had said? No, this wasn't some sudden change of heart. This was something else. This was a warning. I forced out a small laugh, trying to sound unaffected. "Wow, that's unexpected." Daniel hummed on the other end of the line, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah, tell me about it." He just walked right up to me outside the courthouse. Said he wanted to talk. Said it was time to put the past behind us. He paused. Sounded pretty damn sincere, too. I gripped my phone tighter, my nails digging into my palm. My father was playing a game, and I was the only one who knew the rules. "I mean, I guess that's a good thing, right?" I said carefully. "Maybe he's finally realizing he was wrong about you." Daniel chuckled, but it wasn't the warm sound I was used to. It was quiet, sharp. "Maybe." Another pause. "But it's weird, Liv. Really weird. He's ignored me for a decade. Why now? Because he knows. Because he wants to watch me squirm. Because he enjoys this." I swallowed hard. I don't know, babe. Maybe he's just trying to make up for lost time. There was silence on the other end. Too long. Too heavy. Then Daniel spoke again, softer this time. Are you okay? No, of course. Just surprised, that's all. I could tell he didn't fully believe me, but he let it go. Well, think about it. He wants us to pick a night next week. Let me know what you decide. I hung up without another word, my hand shaking as I set my phone down on my desk. My father wasn't just playing games anymore. He was moving his pieces. He wasn't just holding my secret over my head. He was making sure I felt it. That night I could barely eat. I pushed my food around my plate, nodding along to Daniel's words, pretending like everything was fine when my mind was spinning. My father wasn't the kind of man to reach out without a motive. He wanted something from me. The question was, what? The answer came 2 days later. I was at work, halfway through a meeting, when my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. But I knew. Even before I opened it, I knew. Dinner reservation. Friday, 7 p.m. You and Daniel. Don't be late. No request. No question. Just an order. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I had no choice. If I ignored him, he would escalate. He had already inserted himself into my life again. Now he was pulling Daniel into it too. I forced myself to type back. We'll be there. The response came almost immediately. Good girl. I slammed my phone down on my desk, bile rising in my throat. I hated him. I hated the way he controlled everything. I hated the way he could still manipulate me after all these years. And most of all, I hated the fact that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was already losing. Friday came faster than I wanted it to. The entire day my nerves were shot, my stomach twisted and knots so tight I could barely breathe. I kept telling myself that this was just dinner, that my father wouldn't do anything drastic in front of Daniel, that I could handle whatever it was he had planned. But I knew better. My father never played fair. Daniel was excited. He had no idea what this really was. He thought it was a second chance, a moment of redemption, a bridge being rebuilt between me and the man who had tried to rip us apart. He showered, shaved, put on a button-down shirt that I had always loved on him. Do you think this is too much? He asked, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to look like I'm trying too hard. I forced a smile. You look perfect. And he did. But he didn't know he was walking into a lion's den. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place my father frequented, where the staff knew his name and every bottle of wine was older than I was. When we arrived, the hostess gave me a knowing smile. Mr. Ellison is already waiting for you. Of course he was. He was always one step ahead. We were led to a secluded corner table. My father sat there, composed, a half-full glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up as we approached, and for a brief moment I saw it again, that glint of amusement, the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had already won. Daniel, my father said smoothly, standing to shake his hand. It's good to finally sit down together. Daniel shook his hand firmly, the way a man does when he wants to prove something. Yeah, it's been a long time coming. My father gestured for us to sit, and the second we did, a waiter appeared, already pouring wine into my glass. I hadn't even looked at the menu, but somehow he knew what I drank. I swallowed hard. This wasn't just dinner. This was a test. A game. So, my father began, leaning back in his chair, swirling his whiskey lazily. How's business, Daniel? Daniel, ever the good man, took the bait. He started talking about his projects, the houses he was working on, the team he managed. He spoke with pride, with confidence. My father listened, nodding at the right moments, but I could see it in his eyes. The same judgment, the same quiet disdain he had always held for Daniel. Then, just as Daniel finished explaining a new contract he had landed, my father struck. And Olivia? He turned to me, his smile sharp. How's work been for you? Late nights? Big cases? My fingers tightened around my wine glass. I knew what he was doing. I knew where this was going. It's been fine. My father chuckled. Fine. He tilted his head. That's not what I heard. My heart stopped. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Daniel frowned, glancing between us. What do you mean? I opened my mouth, but my father spoke first. Oh, I just mean she's been so busy lately. Always working late. Always out. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the unspoken threat in them. Say nothing. Play along. Daniel's gaze shifted to me, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Uncertainty. Doubt. I forced a tight laugh. You know how it is. Deadlines. Clients. Work never stops. My father hummed, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Yes. I suppose some things never change. I felt sick. He wasn't exposing me. Not yet. But he was planting the seed, feeding Daniel just enough to make him wonder, to make him start watching me the way I had feared. And I knew deep in my gut that this was only the beginning. I could feel it unraveling. My father wasn't saying it outright, but he didn't have to. He was playing a longer game, one that would make Daniel doubt me without needing a single accusation. It was subtle, precise, and worst of all, it was working. Daniel sat straighter, his fingers tightening around his fork. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his voice calm but edged with something else. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even the first hint of suspicion. My father smiled the way only he could. A perfect balance between casual and knowing. Oh, nothing, he said lightly, waving a hand. I just remember Olivia always being dedicated to her work. Late nights, extra hours, always making sure she put in the effort. I assume that hasn't changed. His eyes flickered to me just for a second, daring me to react. I held my breath. If I denied too quickly, too forcefully, Daniel would wonder why I was being defensive. If I stayed silent, it would leave space for him to imagine the worst. My father knew this. He had been manipulating people long before I was even born. So I did the only thing I could. I smiled. Of course not, I said, my voice smooth. You raised me to be hardworking, didn't you? Daniel's eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, as if searching for something. But then he nodded, forcing a small laugh. Yeah, Liv works hard. Always has. For a second I thought I had diffused it. I thought I had dodged the bullet. But my father wasn't done. You know, Daniel, I have to admit, he continued, picking up his glass, I underestimated you. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. What? My father took a slow sip of his whiskey, savoring the moment. I was resistant when Olivia told me she was marrying you. I won't deny that. But look at you now. Running your own team, building houses from the ground up. Not bad for a man with no college degree. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. My father was a master at insults wrapped in compliments, laced with just enough venom to sting. Daniel gave a tight smile. Well, I've never needed a degree to build something real. My father chuckled. Yes, real. That's the important part, isn't it? Something that lasts. Something that isn't just temporary. His eyes cut to me again, cold and knowing. I assume Olivia agrees. My stomach twisted. He was tightening the noose. Daniel turned to me again, and I could feel it this time. The doubt sinking in, the thoughts forming in his mind. My father had done it. He had put the question there, planted the seed that would take root. I forced another smile, this one barely holding. Of course. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I barely heard the words spoken, barely tasted the food. Every time Daniel reached for his drink, his watchful eyes flicked toward me. Every pause in conversation felt heavier. I had lost control. I had spent years carefully balancing my life, hiding my affair, keeping everything separate. And in just one dinner, my father had shattered the illusion. When it was finally over, my father shook Daniel's hand firmly. We should do this again, he said smoothly. Family should stay connected after all. Daniel nodded, but his grip on my hand as we left the restaurant was tighter than usual. The entire drive home was silent. Uncomfortably silent. My heart pounded with every streetlight we passed, waiting for him to say something. Waiting for him to ask the question I knew was coming. But he didn't. Not until we walked inside. Daniel shut the door behind him, tossed his keys on the counter, and finally turned to me. His voice was quiet, almost too calm. Liv, be honest with me. My throat tightened. Are you hiding something? Everything inside me froze. My father had done it. He didn't even have to say the words, didn't have to tell Daniel anything outright. Just a few carefully placed comments, a little bit of doubt, and now the one thing I had feared for so long was happening. Daniel was looking at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out, his brows drawn together, his jaw tight. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But I could see the tension building, the questions racing through his mind. He was waiting for me to answer. I forced a breath. What? Of course not. Why would you even ask me that? Daniel studied me for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the counter. I don't know, he admitted. I guess it's just, something about that dinner felt off. Your dad kept making those little comments, and you barely looked at him the entire time. Like you were afraid of what he was going to say. I forced a laugh. You know how he is. He enjoys messing with people. He's probably just trying to get in my head. Daniel didn't look convinced. Then why do you look like you can barely breathe right now? I swallowed hard. I had been careful for so long, played my part so perfectly. I couldn't let it fall apart now. Because it's my dad, Daniel, I said, my voice wavering just enough to sound real. Because he spent years making me feel like nothing I do is good enough. You know what he thinks about me, about us. Do you really think I'm not tense after having to sit across from him and listen to him pick at my life like that? Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe me. He wanted to push this feeling away, to convince himself that my father was just being manipulative. But doubt had already settled in. He sighed. I just live, I trust you. But, have you really been working late all those nights? My heart pounded. He had never questioned me before. Not once. I could feel the walls closing in. I forced myself to roll my eyes, letting my shoulders slump in fake exhaustion. Daniel. Seriously? You think I'd lie to you? You think I'd spend years fighting for us, defending you to my father, just to throw it all away? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head quickly, like he was trying to dismiss the thought before it could take hold. No. No, of course not. He let out a breath and stepped forward, wrapping his arms around me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. God, I sound like an idiot. I let out a breath of relief as he held me, but it was shallow. Hollow. Because I knew this wasn't over. I had put out the fire for now, but the smoke was still there, still lingering in the air. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My father wasn't done with me. He wouldn't have stopped at dinner. He wanted to control me, to remind me that he could destroy my life if he wanted to. And Adam wasn't gone either. He hadn't texted again since I told him it was over, but I could feel it. He wasn't going to let this go. Everything was slipping through my fingers. And deep down I knew one way or another the truth was going to come out.